Blood dripped slowly from the chains binding Gunner's wrists, forming small dark puddles on the wooden platform. His skin was marked by days of torture, deep cuts on his arms, burn marks from hot iron on his bare chest, purple bruises covering his exposed ribs. The merchants had made sure everyone saw what remained of the feared warrior, a broken man, more scar than flesh, with eyes empty of someone who no longer feared death. The auctioneer shouted ever-lowering numbers, while the crowd in Hedeby's square remained in awkward silence. No one wanted to waste silver coins on a slave who likely wouldn't survive the next moon. Thora pressed the small leather purse against her chest, feeling the last 3 coins she owned. Her brown wool dress was frayed at the edges. Patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. The oval brooches holding her apron had lost their shine years ago. She shouldn't have been there. A widow with no land or protection had no reason to frequent the slave market. But something about that chained man made her stop. Perhaps it was the way he kept his head raised despite his injuries, or how his blue eyes still sparked with defiance when the auctioneer poked him with a rod. He didn't beg, didn't weep. Even destroyed, he remained Viking. The auctioneer was about to declare the auction closed when Thora raised a trembling hand. Her voice came out too weak on the first try, swallowed by the crowd's murmur. The second time, she forced the words out with all the strength she could muster. She offered her 3 coins, everything she had. The silence that followed was absolute. Some women laughed, men shook their heads in disbelief. The auctioneer frowned, clearly insulted by the ridiculous offer, but looked around and saw no other interest. With an irritated sigh, he banged the wooden hammer against the table. Sold. Gunner looked up for the first time since being dragged onto the platform. He studied the woman who had just bought him as if trying to understand a foreign language. She was small, too thin for hard times, with dark brown hair tied in a simple braid falling over her shoulder. There was no exceptional beauty in her face, but her brown eyes carried something he hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine compassion mixed with stubborn determination. She didn't buy him for lust or need for labor. She bought him because she couldn't leave him to die chained like an animal. The guards removed the chains with unnecessary brutality, pushing Gunner off the platform. His legs gave way on the first step, and he fell to his knees in the cold mud. Thora approached quickly, but one of the merchants grabbed her arm before she could help him. The man had breath reeking of sour beer and smiled, showing stained teeth. He asked if she knew what she was getting into, buying a marked warrior. Said that Barbarian had killed 6 men in his last charge before being captured, that he was dangerous, even bleeding and broken. Thora pulled her arm with surprising strength, replied that if he was so dangerous, the merchants shouldn't have sold him so cheap. Gunner managed to stand alone, refusing any help with a sharp look. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that once were powerful, but now seemed barely bones covered with skin. His blonde beard was matted with dried blood and dirt. His long hair fell over his eyes in heavy strands. He limped noticeably on his left leg as he followed Thora through Hedeby's busy market. People stepped aside as he passed, some making protective signs against the evil eye. A defeated warrior was considered cursed by the gods, unworthy of Valhalla. The walk to Thora's small hut on the city's outskirts took almost an hour. Gunner stumbled several times, leaving blood trails on the path's stones. Thora tried to help him lean on her, but he pushed her away with silent firmness. Warrior's pride, she thought, even when there was nothing left to be proud of. The hut was modest, a wooden structure with a turf roof, a single room with a central fireplace and straw scattered on the floor as a bed. There were no furnishings besides a small chest and a crude table. Thora had lived there alone since her husband drowned during a storm at sea 3 winters ago. She lit the fire and heated water in an iron cauldron. Gunner let himself fall against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor with his legs stretched out. His chest rose and fell with difficulty, each breath seeming to cost immense effort. When Thora approached with clean cloths and warm water, he watched her with the distrust of a wounded animal. She began cleaning his wounds without asking permission, with gentle but efficient movements. She had learned basic care from her mother, who had been a vulva in her youth, knowledgeable about herbs and healing magic. The water in the cauldron quickly turned red. The cuts on Gunner's back were too deep, some still bleeding. Thora needed to stitch them with linen thread and a bone needle. He didn't make a sound during the entire process, didn't even flinch when the needle pierced living flesh. He just kept his eyes fixed on the fire, jaw clenched so tightly that muscles jumped under his beard. When she finally finished, it was full night. Gunnar had lost consciousness at some point, his body finally yielding to extreme exhaustion. Thora covered him with her only wool blanket and curled up near the fire, shivering from cold, but satisfied she had done the right thing. She woke before dawn with the clear feeling of being watched. Gunnar was sitting exactly where she left him, but his eyes were open and fixed on her with disturbing intensity. It wasn't the look of gratitude she might have expected. It was calculating, evaluative, like a predator studying possible threat or prey. Thora sat up slowly, keeping her hands visible so as not to startle him. She asked if he was hungry. He didn't answer. She prepared barley porridge anyway. The last handful of grains she owned, she placed the wooden bowl in front of him and returned to the other side of the fireplace. Gunnar ate like a man who hadn't seen real food in weeks, swallowing large portions without chewing properly. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and finally spoke. His voice was hoarse from disuse, deep and rough like stones grinding together. He asked why she had bought him. Thora hesitated, searching for words that made sense. She said she couldn't let a man die like that, not when he still had breath in his lungs and fight in his eyes. Gunnar let out something that might have been a laugh, but sounded more like a bitter cough. He replied that she had wasted her last coins on a dead man who just hadn't fallen yet. The tension between them was as dense as morning fog over the fjords. Thora noticed something different in how Gunnar looked at her now, no longer with simple distrust, but with something more dangerous. Recognition. He had seen women like her before, those who confused kindness with weakness, who thought an act of mercy created a debt of gratitude. But Gunnar felt no gratitude. He felt hunger, not just for food, but for everything taken from him. His honor, his strength, his freedom. And the ancient laws were clear about life debts. A woman who saved a warrior from death had rights over him, but he also had rights over her. Gunnar rose with effort, still unsteady but determined. Thora instinctively stepped back when he took a step toward her, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stopped a few paces away, tall enough that she had to tilt her chin to face him. Then, with deliberate movements, he ripped off the only ring he still wore, a simple worn silver band that had belonged to his father. He extended his closed hand toward her and opened his fingers, letting the ring fall into her palm. His words were formal, ritualistic, carrying ancestral weight. He declared that she had saved him when he was on the brink of death, that his life now belonged to her by right of ransom. But, by the same laws, he claimed her by right of blood debt. Thora's eyes widened in shock as she understood what he was saying. Gunnar had just claimed her as his wife, invoking the old traditions that gave a rescued warrior the right to take his savior if she was a woman without male protection. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. She held the ring with trembling fingers, feeling its weight, not the weight of silver, but the weight of destiny changing course like a ship caught by an unexpected current. Before she could respond, Gunnar staggered again, temporary strength abandoning him. This time, when he fell to his knees, Thora was there to support him. He rested his forehead against her shoulder for just a moment, and she felt the tremor running through that destroyed body. Then, he murmured something she barely heard, words in Old Norse that sounded like an oath or a curse, impossible to distinguish which. The following days unfolded in a dense silence punctuated only by the crackling fire and the creaking of old wood. Gunnar spent hours sitting against the wall, watching everything with feline attention. Every movement of Thora, every entry and exit from the hut, every visitor who approached. He didn't speak unless absolutely necessary, communicating through grunts and penetrating looks. His wounds began to heal slowly under her constant care, though the burns on his chest left red, shiny marks that would probably never disappear completely. Hunger returned with savage force as his body began to recover, but Thora had little food to offer. She sold herbs at the market to survive, knowledge inherited from her mother, who had been a vulva. The town's women sought Thora discreetly, asking for mixtures for birth pains, children's fevers, or work injuries. Men came rarely, suspicious of anything resembling feminine magic. With the 3 coins spent on Gunnar, Thor needed to work twice as hard to get barley and dried meat. She left before dawn to gather roots in the nearby forest, returning with hands dirty with soil and knees stained with moss. Gunnar watched her leave each morning with an unreadable expression, never offering help or comment. The first time he left the hut was 5 days after being bought. Thora was returning from the forest carrying a heavy basket of willow bark when she saw him standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. The weak late afternoon light illuminated his angular profile, accentuating shadows under his eyes and in his cheek hollows. He wore the clothes she had gotten him, a wool tunic too large for his thin body and patched trousers that belonged to her late husband. Everything hung loose, draping from his shoulders like rags on a scarecrow. When their eyes met, Thora saw something new in them, not gratitude or affection, but cold, calculating determination. Gunnar announced that the next day he would go to town. Thora protested, saying he was still too weak, that the merchants who sold him frequented Hedeby and could cause trouble. He responded with a tone that brooked no discussion, making clear he wasn't asking permission. She was his savior by right of ransom, but he was a free-born warrior, not a thrall needing authorization to leave. Thora bit her lower lip, swallowing the sharp words wanting to escape. She realized then that the silver ring he gave her wasn't a romantic gift or symbol of affection. It was debt payment, formal recognition that she had rights over his life, but also that he had rights to claim her. A marriage contract forged in ancient tradition, not in choice or love. That night, Gunnar ate in silence across the fire. Thora had prepared a thin stew of turnip and herbs, stretching the few vegetables she had with water to make it last. He cleaned the bowl completely, sucking up the last drop of broth. Then, for the first time since arriving, he spoke beyond monosyllabic grunts. He told how he had been Jarl of a small village on the northern coast, a settlement of 20 families living mainly from fishing and small trade raids. His voice remained monotone as he described how rival warriors attacked during the summer thing when men were gathered to settle disputes. They burned the main hall with everyone inside, including his wife and 7-winter-old daughter. Thora froze with the bowl halfway to her mouth, her stomach tightening as she imagined the screams trapped in that burning hall. Gunnar continued with no apparent emotion in his voice, explaining he survived only because he was hunting in the mountains. He returned to find ashes and charred bodies. He spent the following months tracking the responsible ones, killing 6 of them before finally being captured in a cowardly ambush where they used nets and poisoned darts. The merchants bought him cheaply from the rival warriors, knowing a deposed Jarl without lands could still yield profit as a heavy labor slave. They tortured him to break his spirit before the auction, making sure any buyer would see only submissive flesh. But they couldn't break what couldn't be broken: his thirst for vengeance. Gunnar raised his eyes to meet Thora's through the fire's trembling flames, and she saw something there that made her shiver. Not madness exactly, but dangerous obsession, hunger consuming everything else. He swore by Odin and the 9 realms that he would kill every man responsible for his family's death, even if it cost his own entry to Valhalla, even if he needed to sell his soul to ice giants or make a pact with Loki. Vengeance was all that remained of him, the only purpose keeping blood circulating in his veins. Thora understood in that moment that she had saved not a grateful man, but a walking dead man with a singular goal. Gunnar had no interest in building a new life or finding peace. He wanted only blood and death. After that, little mattered what happened. She should feel fear, maybe even regret for buying him. But what she felt was strangely similar to relief. At least he was honest about his intentions. He didn't pretend affection or gratitude he didn't feel. He didn't lie about who he was or what he intended to do. He was brutal and direct, like a well-sharpened axe. Dangerous, but predictable in his violence. The next day, Gunnar kept his word and went to Hedeby. Thora followed him from a distance, unable to simply wait at home while he exposed himself to the town's dangers. She saw him enter a dark wooden tavern known for housing mercenaries and men of dubious reputation. She hid among market stalls, pretending to examine fabrics while keeping her eyes fixed on the tavern door. 1 hour passed, 2. The sun began to set, painting the sky blood red. Then the door swung open violently and 3 men stumbled out, laughing too loudly. Gunnar appeared behind them. Moving stiffly but determined, Thora watched horrified as Gunnar caught up with the last man of the group in a narrow alley between 2 warehouses. The attack was quick and brutal, no honor or fair duel. Gunnar simply grabbed the man from behind, one hand covering his mouth while the other held a stolen or otherwise obtained knife. The body fell silently against the wooden wall. Gunnar searched the dead man's pockets, taking some silver coins and a bronze bracelet. He wiped the knife on the corpse's clothes with mechanical movements, then left the alley as if nothing had happened, blending into the crowd heading home before nightfall. Thora felt bile rising in her throat. She had saved a murderer, not an honorable warrior fighting glorious battle, but a man who killed in shadows for coins. When Gunnar arrived home later that night, he threw 6 silver coins on the table with a metallic sound echoing through the small hut. He said that would pay for food for 2 moons, maybe 3 if she was careful. He offered no explanation of where the money came from, and Thora didn't ask. Some truths were safer left unspoken. The following days established a pattern. Gunnar left during the day, always returning with money or valuables. Never much. Enough not to draw attention, to pass as labor or small services. But Thora knew the truth. She saw it in the dark stains he washed from his clothes before she woke, in how he checked the knife hidden under his tunic before leaving. He was hunting, one by one, the men from the gang that attacked his village, and he was using her hut as a base, putting her in danger without even asking if she agreed. She should expel him, should go to the thing and denounce the murders, let the elders decide his fate. But she did none of that. Partly from fear, Gunnar was dangerous and unpredictable, but also from something more complicated she didn't want to examine too closely. There was a part of her, small and dark, that understood that hunger for vengeance. That saw cruel justice in each death he caused. Her own husband had drowned because of a rival jarl who demanded he sail during a storm to deliver tribute. No one paid for that death. No one ever paid when the powerful caused pain to the weak. On the 10th night after the first murder, Gunnar returned different. He limped more heavily than usual and kept his left arm pressed against his ribs. When Thor lit more wood in the fire to examine his wounds, she saw fresh blood staining his tunic. A knife had cut his side, not deeply but enough to need care. He let himself drop to the floor without protest as she prepared needle and thread again. This time, as she sewed the flesh, he watched her face instead of staring into the fire. Thora felt the weight of that penetrating gaze, studying each feature as if searching for an answer to an unasked question. When she finished and tied the last knot, Gunnar grabbed her wrist before she could pull away. His touch was firm, but didn't hurt. He pulled her closer, so near she could feel the feverish heat emanating from his wounded body. Then, for the first time, he said her name, Thora, with that rough northern accent, turning the syllables into something almost reverent. He said she wasn't what he imagined when he woke that first morning. He expected a foolish, romantic woman, a dreamer who believed she could save lost souls with kindness. But she was smarter than that. She saw what he was, what he did, and still hadn't betrayed him or expelled him. Thora tried to explain that she didn't approve of the murders, that she was allowing it only because she understood some men needed justice the elders wouldn't give. Gunnar let out a rough laugh that hurt his chest wounds. He replied that she was lying to herself if she believed that. The truth was simpler and darker. She kept him because she was lonely, because having a dangerous warrior as a shadow made her feel protected for the first time since her husband's death. And because, however much she denied it, there was a part of her that felt dark satisfaction, knowing at least one man was doing something against the injustices everyone pretended not to see. His words fell like stones into the deep well Thora kept locked inside her chest. She pulled her arm abruptly, stepping back until her back hit the opposite wall of the hut. She vehemently denied, said he knew nothing about her or her motivations. But her voice came out trembling and weak, betraying the certainty she tried to project. Gunnar didn't respond, just kept those penetrating blue eyes fixed on her until Thora had to look away. He was right, and both knew it. She was no better than him, just more cowardly, hiding her dirty hands behind moral justifications while accepting the blood-stained money he brought. That night, Thora couldn't sleep. She lay on the opposite side of the fire, listening to Gunnar's heavy breathing as he fought a low fever from his new wounds. The full moon cast silvery light through cracks in the wall, creating patterns that looked like ancient runes. Thora thought of her mother, the vulva who taught her about herbs and healing, but also about the Norns and their threads of destiny. Urd, who wove the past. Verdandi, who maintained the present. Skuld, who saw the future. All three working together to create Weird, the inevitable fate of every living being. Had the Norns woven that moment, tying her threads to Gunnar's? Or had they merely watched as Thora chose her own dark path? Winter came early that year, bringing cutting winds that howled between trees like hungry wolves. Snow covered Hedeby in a white mantle that made every exit dangerous and every return uncertain. Gunnar continued his hunts even in the brutal cold, returning with chapped lips and nearly frozen fingers. But money kept coming. Coin by coin, death by death. Thora used some to buy more wool and dried meat, hiding the rest under a loose floorboard. She didn't know exactly why she was saving that money, what future she was trying to build with blood-stained coins. One morning, Thora woke to find Gunnar crouched by the chest where she kept her mother's belongings. He held a set of runes carved in whalebone, turning each piece between his fingers with unusual care. She sat up abruptly, ready to protest the privacy invasion, but stopped when she saw the expression on his face. It wasn't casual curiosity or disrespect. It was deep recognition, almost reverent. He asked if she knew how to use them for reading. Thora hesitated before admitting her mother tried to teach her, but she never developed the vulva's gift. She saw only bone pieces with marks, not secrets of destiny. Gunnar placed the runes back in the chest with deliberate movements. He said his dead wife had been a powerful vulva, that she read the threads of weird with frightening accuracy. 2 moons before the attack that destroyed his village, she did a reading without him asking. She cast the runes on a bearskin and remained motionless so long, Gunnar thought she had entered a deep trance. When she finally spoke, her voice came out strange and distant. She predicted fire-consuming halls, children screaming, blood-staining snow. She saw Gunnar walking among the dead, an empty man searching for something he would never find. And she saw a woman with dark hair who would save his life but seal his fate. Thora felt chills run down her spine despite the lit fire. She asked if he believed those visions, if he really thought the Norns had woven that moment since before the massacre even happened. Gunnar replied that it didn't matter if he believed or not. The prophecy had come true to that point. His family died in flames. He wandered among corpses, and Thora saved him when he was on the brink of death. What remained of the vision, the part about sealing fate, was still to be revealed. Perhaps it meant she would die because of him. Or he would die for her. Or something worse than death. For days after that conversation, a strange tension hung between them. Gunnar watched her with new intensity, as if searching for signs of destiny unfolding. Thora, in turn, caught herself studying her mother's runes when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to understand symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning, escaping her comprehension. Hagalaz, the rune of destruction. Note is need and suffering. Iza, ice that paralyzes. All present in the set, all carrying dark omens. It was during one of those nights, while shuffling the runes with uncertain fingers, that Thora finally gathered courage to ask what she needed to know. She asked if Gunnar truly saw her as a wife, if the ring he gave had any meaning beyond formal debt. He remained silent so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking away from the fire, he admitted he didn't know. He said, when he first woke and saw her, he felt only anger. Anger at being alive when he should have died. Anger at owing something to someone when he had nothing to give. But as days passed, the anger transformed into something more complicated he had no words to describe. He didn't love her, he made clear. Love died with his family in the burning hall. But he also couldn't deny there was something there, a connection forged in extraordinary circumstances. She kept him alive with herbs and care when anyone else would have let him bleed to death. She didn't judge his dark choices, didn't expel him when he returned with blood on his hands. And there were moments, rare but real, when he watched her working her herbs or mending clothes, that he felt something like peace. Not happiness or contentment, but temporary absence of the constant fury consuming his chest. Thora absorbed those words, recognizing their brutal honesty. He wasn't offering false promises of affection or a radiant future together. He merely admitted she meant something, that her presence mattered in ways he didn't fully understand. It was more than many wives received from their husbands in arranged marriages. And, she realized with surprise, it was enough. She didn't love him either. How could she love a man she barely knew, who brought death like other men brought gifts? But there was mutual respect there, recognition of damaged souls who found temporary refuge in each other. The first heavy snowstorm arrived 3 nights later, turning the world into a blinding white whirlwind. Gunnar was out when it started, pursuing another target somewhere in the city. Thora stayed awake all night, feeding the fire and looking at the door with each wind gust. When he finally returned, just before dawn, he was covered in snow and shivering violently. Frozen blood stuck to his hair and beard. Not his, but someone else's. Thora pulled him inside quickly, removing wet clothes with trembling hands. His body was freezing to the touch, lips blue, fingers numb. She wrapped him in all the blankets she owned and forced him to drink hot herbal tea that increased circulation. Gradually, the shivering subsided and color returned to his face. But he kept his eyes closed, murmuring words in an ancient dialect Thora barely recognized. Phrases about ravens and wolves, about halls of the dead, about eternal fire. She realized he was in some kind of cold-induced fever, his mind wandering between the world of the living and memories of past horrors. Instinctively, Thora began singing one of the old songs her mother used to calm the sick, a repetitive melody without words echoing heartbeat rhythms. It worked. Gunnar stopped thrashing and his breathing deepened, falling into heavy but stable sleep. Thora remained by his side until the gray morning light began filtering through the walls. That's when he opened his eyes suddenly, completely alert as if he had never been sleeping. He grabbed her wrist with enough strength to leave marks, pulling her closer. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated, and for a moment Thora thought he didn't recognize her. But then he focused on her, and something in that gaze changed. Became intense in a different way, not threatening, but desperate. He pulled her closer still, eliminating any distance between them, and pressed his forehead against hers. His words came out hoarse and broken, a confession forced by some combination of fever and proximity to death. He admitted he was tired of killing, of waking each morning with only vengeance to warm him. He said he had completed half his list, that 12 men had already paid for their betrayals, but that each death left him emptier instead of satisfied. He was beginning to fear that when he killed the last one, when no one remained to pursue, he would discover there was nothing left of him, just a shell of a man walking the world without purpose or soul. Thora felt warm tears streaming down her face without realizing when they started. She held his face between her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. She said he was wrong, that there was more to him beyond anger and vengeance, that she saw it in small gestures, how he fixed the broken table without her asking, how he brought extra firewood when he saw she was cold, how he didn't touch her medicinal herbs even when bleeding, because he knew she needed them to earn coins. She said an empty man wouldn't do those things, wouldn't notice another person's small sufferings. Gunnar closed his eyes, and Thora felt the warm moisture of his tears wetting her hands. He didn't sob or make sounds, just let the pain finally escape in silence. They stayed like that for a long time, entwined near the fire while the snowstorm continued raging outside. When he finally pulled away, there was something different in his expression. Not peace exactly, but perhaps acceptance. Recognition that maybe there was a path beyond vengeance, even if he didn't yet know how to find it. But the moment of vulnerability passed quickly. The next day, when the storm finally subsided, Gunnar returned to his habitual silence. The only difference was that now, occasionally, his hand sought hers without apparent reason. A brief touch, almost unconscious, as if he needed to confirm she was still there. Thora didn't comment on it, just intertwined her fingers with his when it happened, offering the only thing she could, constant presence in a world that had taken everything else from him. 3 nights later, Thora had a dream. She stood on the edge of an ice-covered cliff, looking down into a bottomless abyss. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching. Many footsteps, an army marching. She knew, with dream certainty, they came for Gunnar. They came to kill him and anyone protecting him. In the dream, she had a choice. Jump into the abyss and disappear, leaving Gunnar to face his fate alone, or stay and face what came with him. Before she could decide, one of the Norns appeared beside her. She didn't speak, just pointed to the ground at Thora's feet. There, written in frozen blood on ice, was a single rune. Aiwaz, the rune of Yggdrasil, of connection between worlds, of transformation through death. Thora woke gasping, heart racing. Gunnar was awake too, watching her from across the fire. He asked about the dream. She hesitated, then told everything. When she finished, he remained silent for a long time. Finally, he stood and walked to where she was sitting, extended his hand. Thora took it without hesitation, and he pulled her to her feet. Then, for the first time since she bought him at that bloody auction, Gunnar hugged her. It wasn't a seductive or romantic touch. It was a warrior's hug recognizing a battle companion, of two lonely people finding strength in each other against a destiny threatening to consume them. They stayed like that until the fire died to red embers, and Thora knew something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer savior and rescued, or even wife and husband in the traditional sense. They were allies facing an approaching storm. Two damaged people who decided to fight for the right to exist, even when the entire world seemed to conspire against them. And when they finally separated, Gunnar kissed her forehead with unexpected tenderness before returning to his corner. But now he was closer than before, as if an invisible line gradually pulled them toward each other, threads of destiny intertwining in ways not even the Norns could undo. The merchant Kjell arrived on a gray winter day when snow fell in heavy flakes, silencing all sounds. Thora was at the market selling medicinal tinctures when he approached, a fat, middle-aged man with a well-kept beard and fine wool clothes dyed dark red. His fingers gleamed with silver and gold rings, marks of someone who prospered while others barely survived. He bought 3 bottles of remedy for joint pain, paying generously and making polite conversation about the terrible weather. Thora thought nothing of him initially, just another rich client seeking relief for minor ailments. But then Kjell casually mentioned he had heard about the warrior living with her, said some men in town were concerned that solitary warriors usually brought trouble, asked if she wasn't afraid to live with a violent stranger. Thora felt immediate alarm trigger in her mind. She replied carefully that Gunnar was her husband by ancient rights, that he worked as a caravan guard and caused no one trouble. Kjell smiled, but the smile didn't reach his small, calculating eyes. He said he was sure it was true, that he just wanted to ensure she was safe. Then he left, leaving Thora with a feeling of unease she couldn't shake. She told Gunnar about the encounter that night. He listened in silence, but Thora saw muscles tensing in his jaw. When she finished, he asked direct, precise questions. What kind of man was Kjell? How many guards accompanied him? What kind of goods did he trade? Thora answered what she knew, that he was one of Hedeby's richest merchants, that he controlled amber and fur trade routes to Constantinople, that he had a reputation for being ruthless with competitors and generous with allies. Gunnar absorbed the information with an increasingly somber expression. The next morning, Gunnar didn't leave for his usual hunts. He stayed inside the hut, sharpening his knife with a whetstone in slow, methodical movements that filled the air with an irritating rasping sound. Thora tried to work on her herbs, but couldn't concentrate. Tension emanated from Gunnar in almost palpable waves. Finally, unable to bear the silence anymore, she asked what he was thinking. Gunnar stopped sharpening and raised his eyes to her. He replied that Kjell wasn't an ordinary merchant making casual conversation. He was a messenger, sent by someone to assess the situation, to see if Gunnar was really there and what kind of protection he had. The words chilled Thora to the bone. She asked who would send such a messenger. Gunnar explained in a flat, dead voice that 6 men remained on his vengeance list. 6 warriors who participated in his village's massacre and still breathed while his wife and daughter lay cold in the earth. He had killed the weak ones first, those who walked alone or exposed themselves too much. But the last 6 were smarter, more powerful. They knew he was hunting, had seen companions fall one by one, and now they had found where he was hiding. Thora felt panic rising in her throat. She asked what they would do, if they should flee, find a new place to hide. Gunnar shook his head, said there was nowhere to run. Not really. These men had resources and connections. They would keep searching until they found him. And when they found him, they wouldn't care about killing everyone in their path, including Thora. The only option was to confront them, but this time it wouldn't be simple ambushes in dark alleys. It would be direct confrontation, 6 against 1, and the chances of survival were close to none. The following days passed in tense preparation. Gunnar spent hours practicing combat movements in the hut's cramped space, testing the limits of his still not fully recovered body. Thora watched him with a tight heart, seeing how he still favored his left leg, how he breathed heavily after just minutes of effort. He was stronger than when she bought him, but far from the powerful warrior he once was. And he knew it. She saw the frustration in his eyes each time his body failed to obey commands that once were instinctive. Thora decided she wouldn't just wait. If enemies were coming, she needed to be prepared too. She went to her mother's chest and searched for something she hadn't used in years. A small iron dagger with a bone handle carved with protection runes. Her mother gave it to her when she turned 14 winters, saying every woman needed to know how to defend herself. Thora never needed to use it for real, but still remembered basic movements her father taught her before dying at sea. When Gunnar saw her practicing clumsy thrusts, he stopped what he was doing and came to correct her posture. His large, calloused hands adjusted her arm angle, showed where to aim for maximum damage. The proximity during those training moments brought new, uncomfortable awareness. Thora felt the heat of his body against her back as he guided her movements, his breath brushing her ear as he gave low instructions. When he stepped back after a demonstration, their eyes met and held contact a heartbeat longer than necessary. Something passed between them in that moment. Silent recognition that perhaps there wasn't enough time to explore whatever was growing in the shadows between rage and companionship. That night, for the first time, they slept side by side. It wasn't a conscious decision or planned moment. It simply happened. Gunnar fell asleep sitting against the wall while keeping watch, and Thora curled up beside him seeking warmth. When she woke in the middle of the night, she found his arm around her, holding her with protective strength even in deep sleep. Her heart beat faster, but she didn't pull away. Stayed there, listening to the steady beat of his heart against her back, memorizing the feeling of temporary safety before the storm she knew was coming. The attack came 3 nights later, exactly as Gunnar predicted. Thora woke to the sound of wood breaking, the door being broken down with a heavy axe. Gunnar was already on his feet, knife in hand, positioning himself between her and the entrance. 4 men entered in file, all experienced warriors with mail armor and quality weapons. The 5th remained on the threshold, and Thora recognized Kjell, the merchant. But now he didn't wear fine merchant clothes. He wore reinforced leather armor and held a long sword gleaming in the moonlight. Kjell smiled, seeing the hut's configuration. 1 man and a frightened woman, no escape route. He spoke with a voice full of cruel satisfaction, explaining he wasn't really a merchant. He was one of the warriors who attacked Gunnar's village, had assumed a merchant identity after the massacre, using stolen gold to buy a respectable position in Hedeby. And now he had come to collect a blood debt, kill the last of that doomed village's jarls. The other men laughed, a low, unpleasant sound filling the small hut. Gunnar said nothing, simply attacked. The movement was so fast, Thora almost didn't see it. He threw the knife with deadly precision, hitting the nearest warrior's throat. The man fell clutching his neck as blood spurted between his fingers. But then the other 3 were on Gunnar, and there was no room for maneuvering in the cramped hut. Thora saw Gunnar block a sword blow with his forearm, screaming in pain when metal cut muscle. He grabbed the attacker's arm and broke it at the elbow with a brutal twist, but another warrior struck his back with a sword pommel, dropping him to his knees. Thora didn't think, just reacted. She grabbed her dagger and threw herself at the nearest warrior's back, driving the blade into his neck with all her strength. Warm blood gushed over her hands, horrible and sticky. The man screamed and spun, throwing her against the wall. Pain exploded in her skull when she hit hard wood. Vision darkened for a crucial moment, and when it cleared again, Gunnar was standing over 2 bodies, bleeding profusely from multiple wounds but still alive. The 3rd warrior was fleeing out the door, leaving a blood trail. But Kjell remained. He advanced slowly, sword in guard, smile gone and replaced with lethal concentration. Gunnar tried to raise his arms in defense, but his body finally gave way. He was too weak, too wounded. Kjell saw the opening and attacked, sword descending in a mortal arc aiming for Gunnar's neck. Time seemed to slow. Thora saw everything with horrible clarity. The gleaming blade, Gunnar's blood flowing in rivers from his wounds, the triumph expression on Kjell's face. Then something broke inside her, a barrier that had kept her own fear and anger locked away her entire life. Thora threw herself forward, weaponless, without a plan. Just a desperate body movement throwing itself between sword and Gunnar. She felt impact, pain so intense it stole her breath. The blade pierced her shoulder, scraping bone and exiting through her back, but her action broke Kjell's momentum, unbalanced him just enough. Gunnar used that moment. gathering his last reserve of strength to grab Kjell by the throat and squeeze with fingers that knew exactly where to press to cut airflow. Kjell dropped the sword, trying uselessly to pry Gunnar's hands from his neck. But Gunnar didn't let go, kept squeezing as Kjell turned red, then purple, eyes bulging from sockets. When he finally stopped struggling, Gunnar held him longer, making sure he was dead before releasing and letting the body fall lifeless to the floor. Then, finally, he fell too, kneeling beside Thora, who lay in a growing puddle of her own blood. His hands trembled when they touched her face, staining it red. He called her name repeatedly, voice breaking in ways she had never heard before. Thora tried to answer, but only blood came from her mouth. She knew, with the certainty that comes when the body begins shutting down, that the wound was mortal. The sword had cut something vital. She was dying. She saw it reflected in Gunnar's eyes, saw panic and despair fighting bitter acceptance. He lifted her in his arms, holding her against his bloodied chest. Thora felt cold spreading from her center to extremities, fingers going numb, vision narrowing. With her last breath of strength, she raised a trembling hand and touched Gunnar's face, whispered that she didn't regret, that she would choose to save him again even knowing how it ended, that he needed to live now, not just for vengeance, but to prove men like Kjell didn't win, that some things were worth fighting and dying for. Gunnar pressed his forehead against hers, tears falling freely now, murmured a promise in her ear, an oath she barely heard as darkness pulled her down, promised he would honor her sacrifice, that he would live in a way that gave her death meaning. And then Thora felt everything disappear, pain, cold, fear. Just a strange peace as the Norn's threads finally cut her connection to the world of the living. Gunnar held Thora's body until it became cold and rigid in his arms, until the blood stopped flowing and turned into sticky crust. The fire in the fireplace died to ashes, and with it died the last light in the hut. He remained there in complete darkness, rocking her as he had rocked his daughter on rare nights when she had nightmares. But this time there were no comforting words to offer, no promise everything would be all right. This time, the monsters were real and had won. When he finally forced himself to release her body, the gray light of dawn began filtering through the broken door. Gunnar looked around the destroyed hut. Walls stained with blood, bodies scattered on the packed earth floor, Thor's belongings thrown and broken during the fight. Something about that scene struck him with a force no weapon had managed. Thora died protecting him, sacrificed herself for a man who brought only death and destruction into her life. And all he did in return was drag her into a war that wasn't hers, stain her with blood he spilled. But lamentations would have to wait. Gunnar forced himself to move with mechanical purpose. First, he dragged the dead warriors' bodies outside, leaving them in the snow where they would be found. Let them see what happened to those who came after him. Then he went back inside and, with care contrasting with the brutality of minutes before, cleaned the blood from Thora's face and hands, combed her tangled hair, arranged her dress, placed on her fingers the silver ring he once gave as a symbol of debt, but which now represented something much deeper. There was no way to give her a proper Viking funeral. He had no ship to burn, no riches to bury with her. But he remembered something she mentioned once, about a place in the hills beyond Hedeby where her mother had been cremated. A grove of ancient oaks pagans considered sacred, where they said veils between worlds were thin. Gunnar wrapped Thora's body in the finest wool blanket she owned and carried her through the snow, ignoring the lancinating pain of his own wounds bleeding again with effort. The journey took hours. Several times he fell to his knees, too exhausted to continue. But each time he forced himself up, adjusted the precious weight in his arms, and moved forward. When he finally reached the grove, the sun was high and snow sparkled like crystals under light filtered through bare trees. He found what he sought, a circle of ancient stones covered in moss and runes worn by time. Even to untrained eyes, it was obviously a place of power, a location where generations of Völvas had performed their magic and offered sacrifices to the old gods. Gunnar placed Thora's body in the circle's center with reverence he reserved only for the most honored dead. Then he began gathering dry branches and wood, building a funeral pyre with hands that no longer trembled. Physical work was familiar, comforting in its simplicity. When the pile was high enough, he placed Thora on top, arranging her hair one last time. From his own neck, He removed an iron amulet in Thor's hammer shape, the only valuable object he still possessed, placed it on her chest, symbolic protection for the journey to Helheim. Before lighting the fire, Gunnar did something he hadn't done since childhood. He knelt and prayed. Not to Odin, the manipulative god who allowed so much tragedy to fall upon him, but to Freya, goddess of love and war. She, who claimed half the battle dead and took them to Folkvanger's halls, asked her to receive Thora, to recognize her sacrifice as an act of war, as noble as any battle, to give her a place of honor among warrior women and vulvas, where she could finally rest in peace. He lit the pyre with flint, and flames quickly caught the dry wood. He stayed there as fire consumed the body. Watching smoke rise in dark spirals against the winter sky, he thought of all the pyres he had witnessed in his life. His father, war companions, and eventually his wife and daughter. Each fire took a piece of him along, until almost nothing remained of the man he once was. But this fire was different. It didn't take a piece of him. It took everything, when only embers remained. Gunnar gathered the ashes and bones with bare hands, ignoring burns, placed them in a clay pot he brought from the hut, sealing it with melted wax. Then he dug a deep hole in the circle's center, right where the largest oak's roots created a natural hollow. Buried the pot there, covering it with dark earth and white stones from the nearby stream. It wouldn't be a marked tomb travelers would see, but those with eyes to see would recognize the respect in the careful stone arrangement. He sat beside the improvised grave as the sun began to set. His wounds screamed for attention, dried blood pulling skin with each movement. He knew he should seek healing. That infection had probably already started in some deeper cuts, but he couldn't care. Part of him, a large part, wanted to simply lie there in the snow and let the cold take him. Reunite with Thora wherever the Norns had taken her. Complete the cycle of death and destruction defining his existence. But then he remembered her last words, the promise he made. Swore he would live, that he would find purpose beyond vengeance. And oaths once made to a dying person were sacred beyond breaking. If he broke that promise, he would make her death meaningless, reduce her sacrifice to nothing more than waste. And he couldn't do that to her, not when she was the only person in years who saw him as human instead of weapon or monster. So Gunnar forced himself to stand. Every movement was agony. Body protesting continued abuse. He began walking back to Hedeby, leaving the sacred grove and its new occupant behind. But this time he wasn't returning to Thora's hut. That place was dead to him now, stained by blood and memories he couldn't bear. He needed to leave this town, start a new path. But first there was one final thing he needed to do. The two remaining warriors on his vengeance list wouldn't be expecting him now. They would think Kjell killed him, or at least wounded him badly enough to end the threat. They would be careless, confident in their safety. It was the perfect time to attack, and this time, Gunnar didn't care if he survived the confrontation. He just needed to ensure they died first. After that, the gods could do what they wanted with him. He found the first man in a tavern popular among mercenaries, celebrating anticipated victory with mead and women. Gunnar waited in a nearby alley, patient as a wolf watching a deer. When the man finally left, staggering drunk, Gunnar followed silently. The attack was quick and brutal. Knife in the ribs, twist to ensure it pierced the heart. The warrior fell without even time to scream, surprise frozen eternally on his face. Gunnar cleaned the blade and moved on. The last man was smarter, lived in a fortified compound on the town's outskirts, always surrounded by guards. Gunnar spent 2 days observing, learning routines, looking for weaknesses. His wounds worsened each hour, fever beginning to burn in his veins. He knew he was at his limit, that his body couldn't take much more, but he persisted because he had to persist. For Thora, for the promise. On the third night, he found an opening. The man liked visiting a lover in a house separate from the main compound. Always took the same route at the same hour, always with only 2 guards. Gunnar waited on a roof along the route, lying on cold tiles making his feverish body tremble uncontrollably. When the group passed below, he jumped. It wasn't an elegant movement, more controlled fall than precise attack. But it worked. His weight knocked down one guard, and he stabbed the other before they could react. The last man on his list turned to run, but Gunnar caught him in 2 steps despite the lame leg. grabbed him by the nape and slammed his face against a stone wall repeatedly until bones broke and blood splattered. When he finally released, the body fell limp as a rag doll. Dead. All dead. 20 men who destroyed his life, 20 blood payments collected. Vengeance was complete. Gunnar stood there in the dark alley, hands covered in blood, body swaying dangerously, waited to feel something, triumph, satisfaction, relief, anything. But there was only emptiness, the same emptiness he had feared from the beginning. Thora was right. Each death had emptied him a little more, until nothing remained but a hollow shell moved by a promise made to a dead woman. He staggered out of the alley, not caring if anyone saw him. Part of him wanted to be caught, wanted town guards to execute him and end everything. But the streets were deserted in the dead hour of night, just shadows and snow falling softly. His feet carried him without conscious thought, guided by instinct more than reason. When he realized where he was, he found himself back at the sacred grove. At the grave he dug with his own hands. He fell to his knees before the white stones, so exhausted he could barely keep his head up. Blood dripped from his reopened wounds, staining snow around him bright red. The fever burned so intensely now, he saw things in shadows between trees, shapes that could be gods or simply hallucinations of a dying mind. One resembled Thora, standing at the stone circle's edge, watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Gunnar tried to speak, apologize for failing to keep the promise to live with purpose. He killed everyone on the list, but found nothing beyond what he already had: consuming emptiness. He didn't know how to be anything other than a weapon, didn't understand how to build instead of destroy. Thora sacrificed herself for a man who didn't deserve salvation, wasted a valuable life on a lost cause. The words came out slurred and confused, half in Old Norse and half in a language even he didn't recognize. Thora's figure, real or imagined, didn't respond, just kept watching with those brown eyes that always saw more than they should. And then, as Gunnar's consciousness slipped, he heard voices. Not the voices of the dead, but of the living. Footsteps approaching through snow, torchlight piercing darkness. He forced his eyes open enough to see 3 figures entering the grove. Elderly women wrapped in dark cloaks, carrying baskets and wooden staffs carved with runes. Vulvas, priestesses who kept the old ways alive even as Christ's new faith spread through the north. They stopped seeing Gunnar bleeding before the grave, exchanging looks among themselves. The oldest, a woman with white hair reaching her waist, approached slowly, knelt in snow beside him, ancient but firm hands examining his wounds with expert touch. She murmured something to companions, who quickly began unpacking herbs and bandages from their baskets. The old Velva held Gunnar's face between wrinkled hands, forcing him to focus on her. Her eyes were pale as winter ice, but carried centuries of wisdom depth. She spoke with a voice rasping like dry leaves, asking his name and what he was doing there. Gunnar answered with brutal honesty, said he came to die beside the woman who saved his life, that he completed vengeance but discovered nothing remained of him to keep living. The Velva studied him a long moment, then turned to look at the freshly made grave. She asked about the woman buried there. Gunnar told, words coming more easily now, as if a final confession. Spoke of Thora buying him when he was broken and dying, how she healed him expecting nothing in return, how he claimed her by ancient laws, but gradually began to feel something more than obligation, how she died protecting him, a sacrifice he never asked for but could never repay. When he finished, tears flowed freely down his face, mixing with blood and dirt. The old Volva slowly shook her head, said she knew Thora's mother, a powerful Volva who died many winters ago, said the daughter inherited her mother's gifts without fully recognizing them, ability to see hidden truths, to find those needing healing even when they didn't want to be saved. And she said something that made Gunnar's heart tighten painfully, that Thora saw her own death in the runes weeks before it happened, but chose to follow this path anyway, chose to save Gunnar knowing the price she would pay. Gunnar felt as if the world tilted under him. Thora knew, saw in her mother's runes, in the visions Volvas had, that buying him would lead to her own death. And still she extended her hand with those 3 silver coins, deciding his life was worth her sacrifice. It wasn't romantic ignorance or naive kindness. It was a conscious choice, a decision made with full knowledge of consequences. She chose him, chose this fate, and he had despised her, thinking she didn't understand what she was getting into. The vulva continued, her voice taking on prophetic chanting quality. Said the Norns wove strange patterns sometimes, intertwining threads in ways mortals rarely understood. Gunnar and Thora were woven together not by chance, but by purpose. He needed to learn vengeance didn't heal wounds, only deepened them. Needed to find reason to live beyond hatred. And Thora needed to remember she was a vulva even without formal training, that she had power to change destinies, including her own. Together, they completed lessons the Norns planned, even if the price was high. But the vulva also said something else, that destiny threads didn't end with death. Gunnar still breathed, still had choices to make. He could lie there and let snow cover him, reunite with all he lost. Or he could truly honor Thora's sacrifice by living in a way that mattered. Not for his name or glory, but helping others as Thora helped him. Becoming a bridge between violence and healing, using strength that once served only destruction to now protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The other vulvas finished cleaning and bandaging his wounds, applying ointments that burned but immediately relieved some pain. Forced bitter tea down his throat, a mixture that would fight fever and infection. The old vulva said they would take him to a hidden sanctuary in the mountains, a place where old ways were still respected and pursued could find refuge. There he would heal completely. And when ready, he would have a choice: move forward to unknown destiny, or stay and learn the ways of those who served gods through healing and protection instead of sword. Gunnar wanted to protest, say he didn't deserve salvation, that he was stained with too much blood to ever serve sacred purposes. But then he remembered Thora saying she saw goodness in him, small gestures revealing humanity he thought he lost. Remembered her dying with a smile on her lips, satisfied with the choice she made, and understood that refusing this chance would spit on her sacrifice, make it meaningless. If she thought he was worth saving twice, perhaps there was truth in that he still couldn't see. So Gunnar nodded, silent acceptance of a destiny he didn't choose, but would now embrace. The vulvas helped him stand, supporting his weight between them with surprising strength for such old women. As they began walking out of the grove, Gunnar looked back one last time. In the flickering torchlight, he swore he saw a figure standing by the grave, silhouette of a small woman with dark hair, hand raised in final farewell. He blinked, and she disappeared. Just shadows between ancient trees and snow falling softly on white stones. They left Hedeby behind, following a narrow trail climbing into mountains. Snow fell heavier now, covering their tracks almost instantly. Gunnar let himself be guided, trusting those strange women in ways he hadn't trusted anyone since his family's death. Perhaps it was fever talking, or perhaps instinctive recognition that this was the path the Norns wove for him. Either way, he moved forward, each step taking him further from the man he was, and closer to something new and unknown. 3 moons passed before Gunnar could walk without help. The Velva's sanctuary was a complex of stone huts built in a hidden valley high in the mountains, protected from curious eyes by steep rocks and dense forests. A natural hot spring bubbled at the center, steam rising in spirals the Volvas said carried Freya's blessings. There lived 12 women of various ages, all priestesses of the old ways, all choosing isolation instead of accepting the new faith-sweeping Norse lands. They healed Gunnar with a combination of herbs, satyr magic, and unshakable patience. Infections that should have killed him were controlled, deep wounds healed into white lines mapping his body like a history of violence. But physical healing was only part of the process. The Volvas also worked on invisible wounds, those bleeding inside the soul, made him speak about losses, about anger he carried so long it became identity. Made him cry tears he hadn't allowed since his family's death, cleansing poison accumulated in his heart. The old Volva who saved him in the grove was named Sigrid. She was the one who sat with Gunnar on long nights when nightmares woke him screaming, when ghosts of all he killed visited him in sleep. She offered no easy comfort or absolution, just reminded that every choice had consequences, that he would carry the weight of those deaths the rest of his life. But also, that weight didn't need to crush him. It could strengthen. Constant reminder of what happens when hatred governs actions. Could make him better instead of more bitter. When spring finally arrived, Melting snows and filling the valley with wildflowers, Gunnar felt strong enough to leave the hut without support for the first time. He walked to the valley's edge, looking down at lowlands where Hedeby lay hidden beyond distance, place where Thora lived and died, where he completed vengeance that consumed years of life. It seemed so distant now, as if belonging to a different person in a different time. And perhaps it did. Sigrid joined him, moving silently like morning mist. Stood beside him a long time without speaking, just sharing silence. Finally, she asked what he planned to do now that he was healed. Gunnar didn't answer immediately. He had thought much about this question during long recovery nights. Part of him still wanted to simply disappear, become a hermit in the mountains, and let the world below proceed without him. But that would break his promise to Thora, waste the second chance she bought with her own life. So he answered he would descend from the mountains, but not return to Hedeby. He would go west, to lands where war between rival jarls left many orphans and widows unprotected. He would offer services as a protector, not for gold or glory, but for simple food and shelter. Would use skills that once served only destruction to keep safe those who couldn't defend themselves. It wouldn't be a life of honor or fame. No skald would sing of his deeds, but it would be a life that mattered, in the way Thora insisted he still could have. Sigrid smiled, the first time he saw any emotion beyond grave serenity on her wrinkled face. Said he learned well, that he understood the lesson the Norns wove through pain. Then she removed something from inside her cloak. A small silver pendant shaped like Thor's hammer, but with protection runes carved around it. Explained it belonged to Thora's mother, the vulva who saved many lives before her own extinguished. Said Thora would have wanted Gunnar to have it, symbol that strength could serve life instead of death. Gunnar took the pendant with slightly trembling hands. The weight was insignificant, but the meaning enormous. Put it around his neck, feeling cold metal against skin. Swore there, with Sigrid as witness and old gods as judges, that he would carry this symbol until his own death. That every life he protected would be tribute to Thora, payment of a debt that could never be fully settled, but would be honored in trying. He spent 2 more weeks at the sanctuary, learning basic healing herbs from the vulvas and simple first aid training. He had no gift for satyr magic, but absorbed practical knowledge like a sponge: how to stop severe bleeding, which plants relieved fever, how to set broken bones, skills he once would have despised as women's work, but now saw as equally important as knowing where to stick a knife. When time finally came to depart, all the vulvas gathered for farewell. Each offered a small gift: leather wristbands with protection runes, a pouch of medicinal herbs, a new cloak dyed forest green that would help camouflage. Sigrid was last, giving him a walking staff carved from oak, strong enough to serve as weapon if needed, but marked with peaceful traveler symbols. Reminded him he would always have refuge there if needed, that sanctuary would remain hidden and safe for those who knew the ways. Gunnar descended from the mountains alone, moving with confidence he hadn't felt in years. His body still ached on cold days, constant reminders of past wounds, but functioned well enough. His mind was clearer than he remembered, no longer clouded by constant anger or thirst for vengeance. For the first time since that terrible day when he returned to find his village in ashes, Gunnar looked forward instead of back. The journey west took 2 weeks of steady walking. He passed small villages where recent war left visible scars: unrebuilt, burned buildings, unplanted fields lacking men to work land, children with eyes too old for young faces. Each scene reminded him of his own past, of destruction violence left behind, and each strengthened his resolution to make a difference, however small. He found what he sought in a village called Bjorgvik, a settlement of perhaps 50 people trapped between river and forest. The local jarl died in an ambush 6 moons earlier, leaving a young widow trying to maintain order with help only from elders and boys too young to fight. Raiders returned occasionally, taking food and occasionally people to sell as slaves. When Gunnar arrived, he found the village desperately building a palisade of green wood, doomed work that wouldn't withstand serious attack. He offered help without asking payment beyond food and a corner to sleep. The widow, a woman named Astrid with gray eyes and iron determination, studied him with well-founded distrust, asked why an experienced warrior would work for so little. Gunnar answered with honesty that he once served only vengeance and destruction, but now tried to serve something better. Didn't expect her to trust based on words, just asked for a chance to prove through actions. Astrid considered a long moment, then nodded, warning they would kill him if he tried to betray her trust. Gunnar accepted terms without argument, knew he would earn respect only through consistent work, not empty promises. He began immediately, assessing the village's defenses with the expert eye of someone who had attacked many and defended others, made practical suggestions where to reinforce the palisade, how to create hidden ditches with sharp stakes on likely approach routes, where to position archers for maximum coverage. But more important than military preparations, he began to teach, trained older boys and some willing women in basic spear and shield combat, didn't try to turn them into elite warriors. That took years. Just taught enough so they could form a proper defensive shield wall, delay attackers until help arrived, taught simple alert signals, organized patrols, basic preparation, making the difference between massacre and possible defense. He worked the fields too, plowing land alongside old men and helping barley harvest. His hands, once stained only with blood, now dirtied with honest soil. His back that carried armor now ached from different physical effort. And strangely, there was satisfaction in that. Saw tangible results of work. Food growing, defenses strengthening, children laughing instead of crying from hunger. They were small victories compared to glorious battles of the past, but felt more real. When raiders finally returned, 3 months after Gunnar's arrival, they found a transformed village. The palisade was complete and reinforced. Hidden ditches surrounded the perimeter. Lookouts alerted everyone with enough time to prepare. Gunnar positioned defenders exactly where planned, a solid shield formation protecting the main gate while archers covered flanks. He himself stayed behind the line, not leading the charge but offering calm advice and adjusting positions as needed. The raiders were a group of 15 men, experienced mercenaries expecting minimal resistance from a defenseless village. When they found organized defense, they hesitated. Gunnar seized the moment, shouting an offer in a voice carrying across the field. Said the village had no riches worth dying for, that they would find only death if they insisted. Offered to let them leave unpursued if they went immediately. The mercenaries' leader, a burly man with a scar across his face, laughed at the offer initially, but then he really looked at the defenses, at determination on villagers' faces, and recalculated odds, decided it wasn't worth the risk. With a harsh shout, he ordered retreat. The mercenaries left, and for the first time in years, Bjorgvik lost nothing to invaders. No one died, no child was taken, no barn burned. It was a small victory in the great scheme of wars sweeping the north, but for those 50 people it meant everything. Meant they would live to see another winter, that children would grow up with parents instead of becoming orphans. Astrid sought Gunnar that night while the village celebrated with a modest feast. Weak beer, hard bread, but genuine laughter. Said he proved his worth beyond any doubt, that he earned a permanent place in Bjorgvik if he wanted. Gunnar thanked her but explained he couldn't stay indefinitely. There were other villages, other places where Thora's family, the mountain sanctuary Volvas, would send word when they needed help. His life now was the road, moving from place to place, offering temporary protection until communities could defend themselves, but he promised to return periodically. Check how Bjorgvik progressed, and kept his promise. During following years, Gunnar became a known figure across Western lands, not as a celebrated hero or powerful jarl, but as a wandering protector who appeared where needed and left when work was done. Villagers whispered stories about him, a warrior with a dark past who found redemption, a man who fought not for glory but for silent justice. He never accepted more than necessary to survive, never sought fame or recognition, lived simply, carrying only what fit in a backpack. Spare clothes, basic tools, medicinal herbs, and always Thora's silver pendant around his neck. Some nights, when sleeping under stars, he touched the pendant and spoke to her as if she could still hear. Told about people he helped, children he saved, small differences he made. Asked if she approved, if she thought he finally honored her sacrifice. Years turned into decades. Gunnar's hair turned gray, then white. His body accumulated new scars from occasional confrontations, along with age aches. He moved slower, tired more quickly, but he continued, guided by a promise made so long ago, it sometimes seemed to belong to a different life. He visited the mountain sanctuary when he could, bringing news and offerings to the Volvas who saved him. Sigrid eventually died, as mortals do, but others took up the mantle and kept traditions alive. It was during one such visit, when Gunnar was over 60 winters old, that a young Völva named Ragna read runes for him without asking. She was powerful as Sigrid had been, perhaps more, with eyes seeing beyond veils between worlds. Cast marked bones on a bearskin and remained motionless a long time. When she spoke, her voice came out distant and strange, touched by something beyond herself. Said Gunnar's threads were nearly complete, that the Norns would prepare shears to cut soon, but also said he completed a pattern that began with so much pain and blood. That Thora waited on the other side of the veil, not in Helheim where common dead went, but in Folkvangr, Freya's halls where warrior women and Volvas gathered. That the goddess recognized her sacrifice and honored it with a place among the chosen, and that when Gunnar's time came, Freya would consider taking him to those halls too, not for battle deaths, but for lives protected and promise kept. Gunnar listened with a heart beating strongly, but without fear. He lived a long life, longer than he deserved or expected, made a difference, however small, and if there was a chance, however small, of seeing Thora again beyond this world, then death wouldn't be a terrible end, but a long-awaited reunion. He thanked Ragna for the reading, and left the sanctuary for the last time, knowing he wouldn't return. He descended mountains slowly, stopping often to rest, his body finally collecting the price of decades of abuse and hard work. When he reached the plains, he turned not west where he spent so many years, but east, back to Hedeby, back to the sacred grove where he buried Thora's ashes so many seasons ago. It took weeks to complete a journey he once made in days, but he persisted. Had to see that place one more time. Hedeby had changed. The new Christian faith took stronger root. A wooden cross erected where pagan temple once stood. Many old faces disappeared, replaced by a younger generation not remembering the old traditions. But the sacred grove remained, hidden and untouched. Trees grew taller, roots deeper, but the stone circles still marked where Thora rested. Gunnar knelt before the grave, hands trembling with age pressing white stones he arranged with such care decades ago. Spoke to her one last time, not night whispers, but loud, clear words. Told her he kept his promise, that he lived with purpose beyond vengeance, that he helped hundreds over the years, perhaps saved thousands indirectly through teachings and preparation, that he never found another love. How could he? When she set an impossible standard to reach, but that he found peace, that it was enough. Thanked her for seeing something in him he himself didn't see, for spending her last coins on a broken warrior any sensible person would have left to die. Said she changed his destiny completely, turned an instrument of death into a protector of life, and that if there really was a chance of reunion in Folkvangr, he would wait patiently until the Norns cut his last thread. When he finished speaking, Gunnar lay down beside the grave. Hadn't planned it, but felt so certain. His body was exhausted beyond movement, heart beating irregularly in his chest. Snow began falling softly, the first of winter, covering everything in a pure white mantle. He watched flakes fall, each unique and beautiful, and thought of all the small lives he touched, each one important, each one mattering. He closed his eyes, feeling cold penetrate old bones. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost comforting, like a gentle embrace pulling him into deep sleep. Breathing slowed, became shallow, and then, in the space between heartbeats, Gunnar heard a voice, soft and familiar, calling his name the way only one person ever had. Thora. Opened his eyes, or thought he opened, hard to distinguish, and saw her standing there. Not a ghost or hallucination, but real and solid as she was in life. She smiled, hand extended in invitation. Behind her, Gunnar saw Golden Hall shining in distance, warrior women practicing with weapons, while Volvas wove magic around eternal fires. Folkvangr, Freya's halls, and Thora offering to guide him there. Gunnar reached for her hand without hesitation. When their fingers touched, he felt warmth spread through his frozen body. He stood up. No, his body remained lying in snow beside the grave, old and worn, and finally at peace. But he stood up, young again, strong again, free of scars and pain. Thora intertwined fingers with his, and they began walking together toward the golden halls, leaving the mortal world behind. The next morning, Volva's traveling to Hedeby to trade herbs found Gunnar's body frozen in snow, lying beside a long-forgotten grave. Recognized the silver pendant around his neck and immediately knew who he was. Sent word to the mountain sanctuary, and Volvas came to give proper funeral. Cremated him right there in the sacred grove, the same flames that once consumed Thora now consuming him. Mixed his ashes with soil over her grave, uniting them finally and completely. Planted a young oak over the site, a tree that would grow tall and strong, roots intertwined with both their bones, and carved runes on the white stones. Not names, for those would be forgotten with time, but simple symbols. Ewa's, transformation through death. Gebo, gift and sacrifice. Wunjo, joy and companionship. Their story summarized in ancient symbols. Years passed, decades, centuries. The new faith swept Norse lands almost completely, old gods retreating to legends and stories. But the sacred grove remained, protected by instinctive respect even Christians felt. The oak grew enormous and ancient, branches spreading over a vast area. And they said, those who still listened to old stories, that sometimes, on clear winter nights when snow fell softly, two figures were seen walking among trees. A tall warrior and a small woman, hands entwined, finally together beyond reach of destiny or death. And perhaps there was truth in that, or perhaps it was just a story people told to remember that even the darkest lives could find redemption, that sacrifice could have meaning, that love, even the kind forged in unlikely circumstances between unlikely people, could transcend everything. The Norns knew the truth, but they never revealed secrets. Just wove and cut, creating patterns mortals spent lives trying to understand. But for Gunnar and Thora, wherever they were, nothing else mattered beyond the fact they chose each other, against impossible odds, against logic and reason. She spent her last coins to save him. He lived decades honoring her sacrifice. And in the end, they found each other again, not in Valhalla among eternal warriors, but in Folkvanger among those who chose love and protection above empty glory. It was a fitting end for a story that began with blood and chains. Not perfectly happy, too many scars, too many losses for that, but real and true. The kind the Norns wove when they wanted to remind mortals destiny wasn't a prison, but a challenge. Choices mattered. Actions mattered. And sometimes against all expectations, even the most destroyed souls could find their way back to light.